Okay. So what we're going to talk about today, because Clay, Webster, and Calhoun are dead, you know, it, the rest of the information about them would take about 20 minutes. Um, I'm going to save their legacy for the last portion of class. We're going to spend a decent amount of time actually on Abe Lincoln, because a lot of what he does is in reaction to the Compromise of 1850, the Compromise of 1820, although he was much younger then. I told you the book I'm reading, Lincoln's Mentors. Henry Clay plays prominently in it. Clay was on like Lincoln's Mount Rushmore, if you will. Big influence. He also was a fan of Webster, but truly would like memorize Clay's speeches, which is something else. He actually got to meet Clay once at Clay's estate, Ashland, in Kentucky, after he had run for the Illinois legislature. So, and actually, he was a little underwhelmed, which normally is what happens when we meet our heroes, right? If we do get to meet them. He thought Clay was a little too high on himself. So very interesting. But so we're going to talk about Lincoln a bit. We're going to talk about John Brown as well, because of course that plays prominently. And then, as I said, we will end with the legacies of Calhoun, Clay, and Webster. So Lincoln, and not to spoil anything, if you haven't seen this talk already, some of this is going to be in my talk on April 14th for Haverford Township Library and the Haverford Township Historical Association. 1854 is when Lincoln gives his first major anti-slavery speech. And think about it, 1854. So the big three that we've been talking about are all dead, right? And now it's Stephen Douglas is starting to climb the national political ladder. Lincoln is starting to climb that ladder. The Whigs, for all intents and purposes, are just about finished. And remember, a big reason why is because of the Mexican War, the lands that are ceded to America by Mexico afterwards, and the Whigs split into what are the conscience Whigs or anti-slavery Whigs and cotton Whigs or pro-slavery Whigs. And the big fight about all this territory was what would be slave, what would be free, right? And in the Dred Scott decision, Tawney says that the Compromise of 1820 is unconstitutional and slavery can be anywhere. Don't worry about that crazy 3630 line, right? So all these sorts of things are coming to play, and it really brings the rise of Lincoln in this new party. Lincoln was a Whig, but when they broke up, he then goes to the Republican Party. And we're just about a year or two away from the first Republican presidential candidate, John C. Fremont. Okay. A lot of people think, oh, Lincoln was the first Republican presidential candidate. It was actually Fremont. Lincoln is the first Republican elected president. Okay. So it's in the second election where the Republicans break through, and primarily because Democrats were so broken as to varying levels of how severe was their plank going to be with slavery. So Lincoln gives his first speech, an anti-slavery speech in 1854. The day before, Douglas, who was much better known nationally, had given a 3-hour speech on slavery. And remember, Douglas's big contribution here is popular sovereignty, saying that it should be up to each individual state and territory as to whether or not they're going to allow slavery in their borders. And this is what Tawney goes for when he strikes down or says that the Missouri Compromise of 1820 is unconstitutional. He's saying it should be up to each individual state. Douglas is saying this because he has his sights set on the White House. And although he's from Illinois, which technically is a free state, right? He's trying to garner as many Southern votes as possible in a national election. He's thinking ahead. What he does, though, it's almost what's the saying, trying to be too cute by half. He burns both sides of the bridge. Northerners say, wait a second, you're saying that slavery can extend, and Southerners are saying they kind of see through his ploy, or at least they think they do. They say, you're kowtowing to us. You don't really feel this way. So he really ends up kind of burning himself, and senator is as high as he reaches, although he does run for president. So Lincoln responds to Douglas's speech with, very impassioned, fire, brimstone sort of speech, rather than going after slave owners and calling them bad people, right? He says that, yes, they are immoral, and that's what abolitionists are saying, but Lincoln says, I do not see any fundamental differences between those who do own slaves and those who do not. And here's what he says, quote, they, slave owners, are just what we would be in their situation. If slavery did not now exist amongst them, they would not introduce it. If it did not now exist amongst us, or pardon me, if it did now exist amongst us, we should not instantly give it up. I surely will not blame them for not doing what I should not know how to do myself, unquote. And it goes back to the point that Art had made a couple of classes ago. If you're a slave owner, yes, most tend to be better off, and they have other assets, right? Their cotton, their plantation, those sorts of things. But for many people, their wealth is tied up in their slaves. So they're saying, hey, wait, if you get rid of my slaves, my standing in society is going to be it's going to be harmed really badly. I can't say irreparable. There, I just said it. And good thing we got that on tape. But so that's what Lincoln is saying here. He's saying, hey, if I was a slave owner, or if we were slave owners, we'd probably feel the same way they did. We're not saying whether or not it's immoral, but they're saying, hey, it's protected by the Constitution. That's what Lincoln has always said. It's protected by the Constitution. However, he doesn't go as far as Calhoun, who says, if you guys, remember in Calhoun's speech, he uses the word agitation, 6, 7, 8 times. And what is he calling agitation? Those who are against slavery. He's saying that they're agitating, they're creating all these problems. So that's where the difference of opinion lies. So 1858, Lincoln wins his party's nomination for the U.S. Senate. Who does it put him head to head with? Stephen Douglas. And here's where you get the famous Lincoln-Douglas debates. Douglas is running for a third term as a Democrat, with his eye on the 1860 presidential election. There were 7 debates over the next 30 days. Imagine, and again, times have changed. We have a lot more to keep us occupied and busy. But imagine if there were 7 presidential debates. You'd want to jump off the Walt Whitman Bridge. I mean, there are 3, and that seems like too much. One was canceled because of COVID, right? But so over the next actually 70 days, there were 7 debates. There are various factors that help to focus the nation's attention on the debates, on the campaign. First off is Douglas himself. Douglas was was the guy in 1850 who said to Clay, rather than send your compromise of 1850 through in one gigantic bill, which nobody likes, or which everybody has an issue with different parts, cut it up into 7 different pieces, and then it will get through. And that's what happened. His nickname, the Little Giant. And he's also one of the best stump speakers in the Democratic Party, especially with Calhoun now gone. Calhoun was the guy, but he's been dead now almost a decade. So Douglas steps to the forefront. Of course, we're just about at the boiling point when it comes to slavery. And I mean, you could say it's been boiling since really the Compromise of 1820, if not sooner. During the 4 years that led up to the debate, so from the time that Lincoln made his speech in 1854 until 1858, there were numerous explosive and violent events that divided the nation. Journalists, for one of the few times, or one of the first times, actually accompany the candidates, Lincoln and Douglas, writing articles about the debates. And remember, at this time, where do people get their news? Newspapers, right? So think back to when we were talking about Clay and Calhoun and Webster. Their speeches would be reprinted in newspapers nationally, and that's how people learned about them and what they were saying. There's no C-SPAN, which I found hard to believe, but there was no C-SPAN at the time, right, to watch all this stuff. So the whole country is watching this unfold. It really is unprecedented, the coverage that this gets. Up until that time, yeah, you had Jackson, of course you have Washington and Jefferson and some other heavy hitters, but these two really grabbed the spotlight. And remember, it's a senatorial campaign. In 2 years, it'll be the presidential campaign. So Douglas makes himself vulnerable politically when he breaks with James Buchanan, our beloved president from the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, still a stain we can't get rid of. And also Southern Democrats over the issue of Kansas statehood. Remember, the Kansas-Nebraska Act and Bleeding Kansas, going back to into the earlier 1850s, and the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854. Douglas opposed the admission of Kansas as a slave state under the terms of the controversial Lecompton Constitution, Lecompton. That's the state constitution that Kansas submitted to become a state. It was a pro-slavery constitution. It was widely believed to have been the result of voter fraud by Missouri border ruffians who are coming into the state. They're trying to tilt the state towards slavery. And remember, this is what Bleeding Kansas was about. It would have legalized slavery in Kansas. Douglas, who is hoping to appeal to the anti-slavery emotions or beliefs of Northern Democrats. Remember, the Democratic Party, where's their base at this time? It's in the South. It's opposite of today, okay? But he's also targeting Northern Republicans, right? So his thought is, if I can peel some of those Republicans from Lincoln, or whoever the candidate's going to be in 1860, it'll help me. He reinforces his sovereignty stance, and he opposed the Lecompton Constitution as being unrepresentative of the majority opinion in Kansas. He's saying all these people who came in from Missouri, they don't live here. What are they doing? Think of, and not to compare the two, but a contemporary example. Go back to the senatorial elections that took place in Georgia in January, right? And people were saying, oh my gosh, I'm going to move to Georgia so I can vote in the election. Well, people from Missouri aren't saying that. They're saying we're going to go in, cause havoc, and make this constitution, make them vote this pro-slavery constitution. But somewhat similar, but very different. Of course, what do Southern Democrats say, to Douglas as he's trying to peel off Northern Republicans and appeal to Northern Democrats? They're saying, what you're saying is treason. You are not one of us. You are doing this to survive politically, and it's only going to hurt you. Lincoln knows that he has to attack it from a different manner. And that the temptation that some Republicans had to vote for Douglas could really hurt the new Republican Party. So he's targeting them. So Lincoln's first speech is the famous House divided speech. A house divided against itself cannot stand. Lincoln actually gets that line from, he massages, if you will, a line from one of Aesop's fables. Lincoln, and I learned this, I did not know this. I learned it in the book I'm reading, Lincoln's Mentors. Lincoln is known for having a superior wit and being able to, speak to the common man and tell a fable, a story, a riddle in order to emphasize a point. So he actually takes that line. Now, again, it doesn't exactly say a house divided itself against itself cannot stand, but he forms it into that from one of Aesop's fables, which is amazing to me. I'd not known that. He delivers that in Springfield on June 16th of 1858. It is seen as one of the most important speeches in American history. It warns. Now, he's not the first one to warn that slavery is going to, the crisis over slavery is going to not be resolved until the nation is either totally one or totally the other. But this is what he's saying in the House divided speech. He turns on Douglas by saying that the threat to American unity came from Douglas's popular sovereignty idea. So he's basically training his guns on Douglas and saying it's this guy's fault that we are where we are today. Of course, a lot of water has gone under that bridge, but it's something that we see today. Any election, if I'm running against Art's going to say, well, here's why, Jim is nuts because of A, B, C, and D, and Art's probably going to be correct. But what's my response? Rather than say, oh, no, let me explain my stance. The easier thing and what grabs the spotlight is if I say, well, Art's crazy because of E, F, G, and H. So, and that's unfortunately the way our political discussions have become. But what happens here is that Lincoln says, if you follow Douglas's popular sovereignty idea, you're going to have a dozen Bleeding Kansas episodes in which settlers will fight over slavery so that they can get the upper hand in their new territory and set up the new state constitution as they wish. So, of course, Douglas is saying, but wait, popular sovereignty and the Compromise of 1850 have pushed the slavery. We were close to civil war. We were close to breaking up. This was an answer. Well, it was a temporary answer. So Lincoln charges Douglas, and again, not the first time this has happened. Lincoln says that Douglas is part of a secret cabal to spread slavery into the free states. He says, Lincoln, that slavery is immoral, but, and this is where he differs from abolitionists, And John Brown, who's saying, if I take over the armory, which is still a year away in Harper's Ferry, then slave uprising and slavery's over. Lincoln saying the only way that we can do this is through acts of Congress. For Lincoln, slavery violated the fundamental assertion of the Declaration of Independence, which Lincoln saw with the Constitution as bedrocks. Now, of course, the Declaration of Independence, it's basically that. It's a declaration. It's not law. It's what our country was founded on. But the Constitution is law, and that's what Lincoln holds on to dearly. So Lincoln says, I agree that all men are created equal. He argued that slavery's continued existence and support in America ran counter to the wishes of the founding fathers, even though many of them were slave owners. He goes on further and says, ultimately, only the power of the federal government could resolve the issue by extinguishing slavery. So, of course, that gets the South's attention. You're about a year after that Dred Scott decision, after the Dred Scott decision, where where Southern newspapers have said, hey, the law of the land is slavery now, slavery forever, right? So Lincoln contended that there existed no constitutional way of interfering with slavery where it currently existed. However, he is a firm believer that it should not extend westward. So after Douglas has taken, body blow, body blow, body blow, he responds. And what's the easy thing to say? He says, Lincoln is an abolitionist. Abolitionists were seen as too liberal, too progressive. He disagrees with Lincoln's claim that the founding fathers opposed slavery, saying just what I said. He said, listen, many of them own slaves. He played down the issue of morality in favor. He played down the issue of morality in favor of his commitment to a Jackson egalitarianism. So remember, Andrew Jackson, he was voted in by the common man. Everybody should be at the same place. So Douglas is saying for white Americans, that's the ideal. He said that the power to decide about the existence of slavery should be left to each community and on the local level, which again is big stuff because this hasn't really been done, especially after Jackson. The power in the federal government has grown, specifically in the presidency. Douglas goes on and argues that slavery, and he's not the only one, but he says slavery will not survive outside the South for simple economic reasons. He asserted in his Freeport Doctrine, which was delivered in Freeport, Illinois, that the people could keep slavery out of their territories. Despite the Dred Scott decision, Douglas claimed that local communities could decide for themselves to not pass local police laws to preserve slavery and protect slave owners. He warned America not to try to judge political issues on moral grounds. Otherwise, we will be in a civil war. Ultimately, Douglas says it really comes down to two conflicting ideologies: a view of America as a confederacy of sovereign and equal states, which is, of course, what the South says, and that's what Jefferson Davis says when they withdraw from the Union, when they secede, That's on one side of the ledger. On the other side, you have a federalist empire of consolidated states, which might be a bit harsh. So he accuses Lincoln of being an abolitionist and a dangerous fanatic whose policies would result in racial consolidation and racial equality, which, of course, unfortunately, terrifies people at the time. In doing so, Douglas is appealing to racial prejudices of Illinois voters. It was on the last issue of racial equality that Lincoln had the most difficulty in answering Douglas. Lincoln could not declare that slavery was immoral and that African Americans were endowed with God-given rights as presented in the Declaration of Independence without leaving himself vulnerable to Douglas's attacks. Lincoln says, or Douglas is saying, that either African Americans are equal to whites or they are not. Lincoln answered by trying to contend that there were physical and social differences upon the footing of, between the races that would, quote, probably forever forbid their living together upon the footing of perfect equality, unquote. So in one respect, Douglas is beating Lincoln on this issue, because when you then have to explain your stance to such a degree, people are saying, wait a second, Douglas has kind of hit Lincoln hard on this. True to his free labor Republican ideology, Lincoln insisted, quote, that there is no reason in the world why the Negro is not entitled to all the natural rights enumerated in the Declaration of Independence, the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, unquote. So Lincoln does not think that they have the same rights as whites. Lincoln's argument for the end of slavery is that, so he would say, Wendy, would you work for free on your farm? Fran, would you work for free in the factory where you're working? No, it's unfair of us to make slaves work for free and not, and the term he used repeatedly, not enjoy the fruits of their the fruits of their labor. So he's saying none of us work for free, they shouldn't work for free. And many times when somebody politically is making an argument, what is the strongest argument? The economic argument, right? Normally, unless you just totally despise a candidate and you say, hey, it doesn't matter what this guy says. And we've seen that. But many times the economic argument carries the most weight. So Lincoln opposed voting rights for African Americans. He did not want them to sit on juries, to hold public office, or to intermarry with whites. He said that blacks were equal to all men in their freedom to earn their just rewards for the work they did, rather than to have those earnings confiscated. After Lincoln loses to Douglas, he abandons the Whig Party, which really is all but over, and joins the new Republican Party. The new National Party, as I said, it's composed primarily of conscience Whigs, but you also have some Democrats who are anti-slavery. You also have a contingent of voters known as free soil, the Free Soilers, pardon me, or Free Soil Party. And these are people who do not want slavery to expand. Republicans were dedicated to the repeal of the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854 and the prevention of the further spread of slavery westward. They demanded, Republicans, the immediate admission of Kansas into the Union as a free state. They denounced what was called the Ostend Manifesto, Ostend. And what that called for was the annexation of Cuba, where slavery was legal. Republicans also called for a federal support of internal improvements, especially the construction of a railroad to the Pacific. Who was pushing for this 30, 40 years ago? Henry Clay, the American system. Lincoln, as a favorite son candidate from Illinois, was placed in nomination for vice president in 1856, but failed to win at the convention here in Philadelphia. Afterwards, he goes around the nation campaigning for John C. Fremont. And what does that do? It raises his national visibility, but it also creates goodwill in the party, so that in 1860, when Lincoln does run, he can call on people to say, hey, remember what I did in 1856? So the Republican Party loses to Buchanan. They carry Illinois, Lincoln's home state. They win about 30% of the overall vote, okay? Lincoln's position on social and political equality for Blacks evolves over his presidency. In the last stage of his life, and this literally is delivered about 3 days before he dies, 4 days before he dies, April of 1865, he argues for limited Black suffrage, saying that any Black man who had served the Union during the war should have voting rights. Of course, what happens? You then have the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendments, and ending slavery, extending Black voting rights to males, and also Blacks are now American citizens. So 3 very big pieces of legislation, which, if you remember from the Supreme Court talks that I've given, those really, the 14th and 15th Amendments play huge roles, especially a century later, Brown versus Board of Education and some of the other civil rights cases that come up. Any questions while I take a sip here? Any comments? Okay. Wendy, you have something?
Yeah, okay. Did I get myself unmuted?
No, you're good.
Okay. 2 things going back several minutes.
Yep.
The Lincoln-Douglas debates for Senate, you're talking about press coverage.
Yes.
Were those debates covered much outside of Illinois?
Yes,
Okay.
You had national newspapers. You had Harper's, which was big at the time, traveling with them, press of that ilk. Yes, locally, but also nationally. And then what happens at that time too, Wendy, is that stories will be picked up from a local paper by a larger paper and then reprinted. And that's how, coverage expanded nationally.
Okay, because I mean, I couldn't see anybody caring about 2 Pennsylvania senators, unless there was something national going on in it. Okay.
Right. And I think the biggest draw, Wendy, was because of Douglas. Douglas is the much, much bigger name here. And Lincoln is a rising star, but he's still, Lincoln has lost more races than he has won, but it's his anti-slavery stance which grabs people.
Okay. The other thing is, do you have any idea when shorthand was invented or standardized?
I don't.
You're saying they're transcript, kind of like transcripts or the reporting, and I'm going like,
Right.
It seemed to me that was more like a late 1890s sort of thing, or early 20s. So they were just writing as fast as they could.
Pretty much. Well, and I think what also happens, and politicians know this, so as they're handwriting their speeches, they're absolutely sending copies to local
Yeah.
newspapers, more regional or national
Yeah.
newspapers, because of course it's kind of an ego stroke for them to say,
Mhm.
hey, my speech was printed in the New York Times or, the Louisville Kentuckian or
Mhm.
whatever it may be.
And you
So
just
yeah,
hope
that's a
that
good
what
question
they
about
said
shorthand.
is what they wrote.
Right, right.
Yeah.
I'll
Okay.
write it out by hand.
That's it.
Some of them would
Somebody has to
use,
make hand copies of that,
right,
and I'm sure they
right.
were all female. No. Uh,
But no, good question about shorthand. I don't know if someone wants to get extra credit and Google the invention of shorthand,
mhm.
you'll get a gold star for today while I'm
Okay.
rambling on.
Uh-huh.
Good questions though. Thank you.
Okay.
Okay. So we will move on. So Lincoln, for much of his career, Lincoln actually thought colonization was the way to go. Who was the founder, one of the founders of the American Colonization Society in 1821? Henry Clay. So again, it just shows you, the impact that Clay has on Lincoln's life. Lincoln will follow Clay to the ends of the earth. Bert, do you have a question?
Shorthand, a method of rapid writing by means of abbreviations, especially for taking dictation, devised in 1837 by Sir Isaac Pitman and
Wow.
in 1888 by John Gregg.
Okay, good to know. Thank you. There we have it.
That's weird.
So colonization was, hey, rather than, and again, it's a really sloppy way, of course, a really bad way to take care of slavery. But Lincoln, amongst others, is saying, let's just round up all the slaves and freedmen and send them to Liberia. Let's send them to South America. And of course, if you're a freedman in Massachusetts, you're saying, wait a second, why do I want to leave? Even if you're a slave, you're saying, wait, I've lived here. I was born here. This is all I know. Why do I want to go back? Even though you may be freed, right? So just not a really good decision. He first pushes for colonization in 1852 and 1854, and he's the one who talks about Liberia. However, nobody, of course, people with slaves said, so wait a second, you're going to pay me $400 a slave? And that was part of the deal with colonization. It's also what Lincoln does when he's president. It's one of the ideas he floats. Hey, we will reimburse you for your slaves. Well, what if I paid $1,000 for a slave? Am I going to take 400? Absolutely not. So, again, and even if I paid 200, maybe I'll take 400, or maybe I'm thinking, wait, I still have 20 more years of labor potentially from this slave. And then if they have children and they have children, so on and on and on. So just colonization was not a viable alternative, although it was one of the major ones that was floated at the time. So John Brown, we're going to move on to. So Brown, interesting man. There's a book by the historian H.W. Brands called The Zealot and the Emancipator. And it talks about Brown and Lincoln because of pretty much contemporaries. Bottom line, Lincoln thought Brown was crazy. He did not agree with Brown's methods. He thought it only hurt the anti-slavery cause. Brown had been moving throughout the mid-Atlantic and Northeast. So Ohio, Pennsylvania, New York, Massachusetts. He has a large family. He is barely able to support them. Brown actually met on more than one occasion Frederick Douglass. He tried to recruit Frederick Douglass to the Harper's Ferry operation. And Douglass said, no, thank you. I don't want to do it. Though, of course, Brown is white, in 1849, he settles with his family at North Elba, New York, which is a community of Blacks, on land donated by a New York anti-slavery philanthropist. Brown had been anti-slavery from the start. In the Ken Burns series, the Civil War, when they talk about Brown, you know how before each segment they have like a 2 or 3 word title for that segment? Brown is called the Spark because people look at Brown as sparking the Civil War. It was the straw that broke the camel's back, so to speak. Brown had been obsessed with the idea of taking overt action to help win justice for slaves. In 1855, he and 5 of his sons go to the Kansas Territory. So we're right after the Kansas-Nebraska Act to work with forces, anti-slavery forces, who are struggling for control there. So Brown is in the midst of bleeding Kansas. With a wagon full of guns and ammunition, he settles in Osawatomie. Say that 5 times fast. Osawatomie, and became the leader of anti-slavery guerrillas in that area of Kansas.
Jim, it's Osawatomie.
Oh, I knew. Thank you. Thank you, Art. I knew you would know. I should have asked you. Say it again.
Osawatomie.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. Osawatomie, Osawatomie. Say it 5 times fast. So Brown is upset where the University of Kansas is in Lawrence was sacked by forces during bleeding Kansas. It was burned to the ground by slavery sympathizers in May of 1856. Brown says, I have a divine mission to get vengeance. Brown, and I'm sorry I don't have the quote. You can look it up online, or if you watch the Ken Burns series, he stands up in the back of the church and basically says, as God is my witness, I am on a campaign to end slavery, and the only way that this will be purged from our land is with blood. And then he walks out of the church. So Lawrence, Kansas is burned on 5/21/1856, May 21st, 1856. On May 24th, Brown leads a nighttime attack on a pro-slavery settlement at, Art, I might need you, Potawatomi.
Potawatomi.
Close, Potawatomi Creek. He and his sons dragged 5 men out of their tents, homes, what have you, and hack them to death in front of their families. Brutal, absolutely brutal stuff. After the raid, which became known as the Potawatomi Massacre, the name of old Osawatomie, yes, Brown, quote unquote, that's his nickname, tough one to say. What it does is his name and legend spread, and it spreads fear in pro-slavery forces. What helps Brown is he starts moving around because he's now wanted. At that time, what do they have? Wanted posters, right? Nobody knows what he looks like. So he would disguise himself many times, put on a beard, a hat, or whatever to change his appearance. And many times it's like the bad Hollywood movie where he's in a group of people and they're talking about him, not knowing that he's the guy that they're talking about, saying, oh my gosh, this guy Brown is going around scaring the heck out of people. And he would be in the group. So in spring of 1858, Brown convenes a meeting of Blacks and white supporters in Chatham, Ontario, Canada, where he announces his intention of establishing in the Maryland and Virginia mountains a stronghold for escaping slaves. Historically, from really and before the founding of the country, one thing that absolutely, positively terrified slave owners was a slave rebellion. Think of the Nat Turner Rebellion, right? From history. They were terrified that slaves would become armed and then roam the countryside and kill them and their families. So Brown proposes, and there is a convention being held in Canada. The convention adopts a provincial constitution for the people of America. Brown is elected commander-in-chief of this new paper government, while gaining financial support, importantly, gaining financial support from prominent Boston abolitionists. Once Brown is caught and hung, several of these abolitionists are terrified that the government is going to come after them because they funded Brown. Some of them had also given Brown support when he was in Kansas, wreaking havoc. In the summer of 1859, with an armed band of about 16 white and 5 African-American abolitionists, Brown set up headquarters in a rented farmhouse in Maryland, across the Potomac from Harper's Ferry, where there is a federal armory. If you've never been to Harper's Ferry, check it out. Extremely cool. Basically go about as far west as you can in Maryland, and then over the line is Harper's Ferry. It's a really cool town. It's on a hill, on an incline. On the night of October 16th, 1859, he takes the armory quickly and rounds up 60 leading men of the area as hostages. Brown hopes that slaves that escape are going to join the rebellion, forming an army of emancipation, as he called it, to liberate fellow slaves. Throughout the next day, so throughout the 17th of October, he and his men held out against the local militia. But on the 18th, who shows up? Federal troops under the leadership of Robert E. Lee. If this was a movie, you'd say, come on, this is unbelievable. Who else was at Harper's Ferry? Stonewall Jackson, John Wilkes Booth. I mean, you name it, they were there. Brown is wounded by federal troops. 10 of his followers, including 2 of his sons, are killed. One of the blacks who was in Brown's band was also killed. Brown is tried for murder, slave insurrection, and treason against the state of Maryland, and was convicted, or against the state, yeah, that's still Maryland at the time, or Virginia, because it's still part of Virginia, sorry, and was convicted and hanged. As I said, John Wilkes Booth was one of the militiamen at the hanging. Brown, of course, he failed to spark that slave revolt, but he absolutely raises the coming war to another level. Europe is watching, very interested, I should say. And Union troops, as they march to war, during the war, what song do they sing? John Brown's Body, to the tune of the Battle Hymn of the Republic. In the 1860 Republican Party platform for the presidency, they actually denounce Brown's raid, because outside of abolitionists, who again were seen as the most, the farthest end of the spectrum, anti-slavery, and then you have the other end, the John C. Calhouns of the world saying states' rights, slavery, it's protected. What the Republican Party is looking for is those people in the middle who say, hey, you know what? I don't agree with slavery, but I also think what John Brown did was wrong. So that's why they denounce, as part of their platform, Brown's raid. So let me see here. Let me see what I've got. I don't want to bury you too much here. I do want to talk, we're at about 5 of. So bear with me 1 second, because I might have more here than you really need to see or that we need to discuss. One thing we will talk about is Lincoln's inaugural speech, which is, you can Google it, I can email it to you, but compare it to, now granted, it's almost 25 years after Calhoun speaks, right? Where he uses the term agitation over and over and over. Lincoln's speech, I shouldn't say speech, inaugural address is absolutely fascinating. Absolutely fascinating. So between the time of his election and inauguration in March of 1861, 7 states secede. Of course, more follow. Delegates from the states that secede meet in Montgomery, Alabama, and they form the Confederacy. They draft and pass a constitution that was very similar to the US Constitution, except in 4 areas. The Confederate Constitution supported state sovereignty, guaranteed the perpetual existence of slavery in states and territories, prohibited Congress from enacting a protective tariff and giving government aid to internal improvements, and limited the presidential term to 6 years. So, of course, Jefferson Davis is named president. He was a Mississippi slave owner. He was a mover and shaker in the US Senate before this. His vice president, Alexander Stephens, was actually very good friends with Lincoln during Lincoln's time in Congress. So let me first, I'll talk quickly about what what Davis says during his speech, his inaugural, if you will. He emphasizes secession as a peaceful move that rested upon the consent of the governed to alter or abolish forms of government destructive to their freedoms and interests. Sounds exactly like John C. Calhoun. The Southern position assumed that America was a compact of states. Lincoln, of course, goes the other way, says absolutely not. Each state individually agreed to allow the national government to act as its agent without relinquishing fundamental sovereignty. Again, sounds like Calhoun and nullification. Any state at any time could withdraw from the compact. Of course, Northerners see the Union as permanent. And this is why, when the war starts, what does Lincoln say the reason for the war is? War for Union. If he says it's slavery, he's going to lose a third or half of the Northern population. And they're going to say, you're absolutely nuts. No way. So this is a huge, huge deal. Lincoln responds and says he denies that the states had ever possessed independent sovereignty as colonies and territories. He claimed that the states accepted unconditionally the sovereignty of the national government with the ratification of the Constitution. To Southerners who claimed the right of revolution as a means to justify secession, like the founding fathers did. So many in the South said, hey, this is the second American Revolution. And Lincoln is saying, you're crazy. Absolutely not. Lincoln responds, he's a lawyer. So with legalistic distinction rooted in common sense. The right of revolution is not a legal right, but a moral right that depends upon the suppression of liberties and freedoms for it to be justified. Lincoln asks, what rights, freedoms, or liberties were being trampled by my election? The South still enjoyed all constitutional freedoms that they always enjoyed, including slavery, right? To exercise revolution with no moral cause to justify it is, quote, simply a wicked exercise of physical power, unquote. Most Northerners agreed with Lincoln that secession amounted to an unconstitutional act of treason. So between the Montgomery, see you, Wendy. And Wendy, I'll post the video like tonight, tomorrow, and you'll be able to see the rest. So Lincoln passes the time between the Montgomery, Alabama Convention and his inauguration in silence, doesn't say a word. He does talk to Congress privately and to key military officers. He says, and he reiterates strongly, that the campaign, that his promise, quote, campaign promise that he would take no action as president to impair or limit slavery where it existed. He said the first 13th Amendment that was proposed, but was not ratified, would guarantee slavery in the existing slave states, which is crazy. What does the actual 13th Amendment do? It ends it. Or do you have something?
Yeah, that's the Corwin Amendment. I've always been intrigued by it because it made it through the Senate after those 7 states had seceded. So basically, it was a Northern vote of 2/3 to get it out of the Senate. So it's always been kind of intriguing how that whole relationship between the North and slavery, and I think what I guess the legislatures of the North felt about it by letting that amendment pass through. That was Buchanan, that was president at the time.
Right, correct.
And also, Lincoln sent that amendment to the states as required by law.
Right.
Which is kind of another one kind of interesting.
Absolutely. So, and it makes you think, Art, that at this point, the North is saying, oh my gosh, so these wahoos down south have seceded. Maybe the way to save the Union is to, have this amendment become law. And that's, remember what Lincoln says. He says, hey, listen, for me, it's all about union. So if it means that slavery stays the way it is, I'm down. If it means I free all the slaves and we still have the Union, I support that. If it means I only free half the slaves and we have the Union, I'm down for that. So he was very, again, the ultimate goal is Union. I agree with you, though. The North for so long yelling about the extension of slavery, basically saying, hey, you guys can have it where it currently exists and we won't mess with it. So interesting stuff. So what happens is that Lincoln, or pardon me, let me step back. Senator John Crittenden of Kentucky puts forth what is called the Crittenden Compromise, and it's a package of proposals. It included a series of constitutional amendments to guarantee slavery in the states. The compromise sought to prohibit Congress from abolishing slavery in the Capitol in Washington, D.C., and deny Congress the power to interfere with the interstate slave trade. It also empowered Congress to compensate slaveholders who lost runaway slaves to the North and protected slavery south of the infamous 3630 line in all territories, quote, now held or hereafter acquired, unquote. So Crittenden is saying, we're, in the territory we have now, but anything else we gain as manifest destiny gains steam. Lincoln says, are you out of your mind? Absolutely not. He understood that to accept the Crittenden Compromise would basically overturn the Republican Party platform. He said to party leaders, do not make any concessions on slavery expanding. The compromise is defeated in the Republican-controlled Congress. Lincoln rejected overtures. Some from the South said, hey, let's have a peace convention and talk about this. And former President John Tyler was going to head the talks. Lincoln said, John, beat it. I'm not going to do this. So Lincoln, in his inaugural, he's looking to keep the border states, the Upper South, as part of the Union. He reaffirms his promise not to interfere with slavery where it existed. And he says to the Confederates, we'll pretend like the Montgomery Convention never took place. I will not take action against you. However, Lincoln says that, quote, I will hold, occupy, and possess property and places belonging to the government, unquote. He reminded the Confederates that no state could leave the Union upon its own mere notion and pledged to enforce the laws on the books. Quote, in your hands, my dissatisfied fellow countrymen, and not mine, is the momentous issue of civil war. Day after the inauguration, Robert Anderson reaches out to Lincoln. He's the commander at Fort Sumter and says, hey, I need help. Lincoln wisely sends down an unarmed boat with supplies that the Confederates stop. So what does this do? It puts the blame for the Civil War on the South. All right, let's see here. We're going to move from Lincoln. If we have time at the end, we'll come back to him, but you guys might be Lincolned out here. So I'm going to talk a bit about the legacies of Calhoun, of Clay, of our good friend Webster. Sorry, I forgot his name. Sorry, Daniel. So, Calhoun, he contributes as much to the Civil War coming really as anybody else, because think of it, for decades, he is one of the leading voices for states' rights. Think of all the positions he holds. He makes it as far as the vice presidency. And when he is vice president under Jackson, he disagrees with Jackson on the bank issue and nullification and those sorts of things. And that's what gets him booted, basically, back to the Senate. He is a staunch nationalist during the first half of his public life, who told the son of Alexander Hamilton in 1823 that his father's attempt to create a strong federal government, quote, as developed by the measures of George Washington's administration, is the only true policy for this country, unquote. You read that and you think, wait a second, he's not talking about states' rights. He sounds like a federalist, right? And that's what Hamilton was. So, of course, in the later part of his career, Calhoun is one of the loudest voices for states' rights. And what is the ultimate states' right? So when people say, hey, the war was about states' rights, the states' right is slavery. That's the states' right that they are talking about. Before his death, shortly before his death, Calhoun says, quote, if I am judged by my acts, I trust I shall be found as firm a friend of the Union as any man in it. If I shall have any place in the memory of posterity, it will be in consequence of my deep attachment to it, meaning the Union, unquote. This is a guy who basically calls half of the country agitators because they're anti-slave or they're anti-slavery expansion. After his death, one of his minions, if his will, or proteges, by the name of James Hammond, says that Calhoun, quote, preeminent as he was intellectually above all men of his age, he was so wanting in judgment in the managing of men, was so unyielding and unpersuasive that he never could consolidate sufficient power to accomplish anything great of himself. The jealousy of him, his towering genius and uncompromising temper has had much effect in preventing the South from uniting to resist evil, unquote. So basically saying, yes, Calhoun is one of the loudest voices, but it was all about Calhoun. And because he could not build alliances, right? That's what you need in our system of government. It's not one person, although there are times where we think it might be. But Calhoun was unable to build alliances because basically it was his way or the highway. Calhoun writes 2 books on government, which are published after his death. And his many speeches in Congress gained him a reputation as one of the foremost American political theorists. Now, of course, what theory is it? States' rights, right? It's the power of the state. He has been compared, this is a first for me, but I get it. He's been compared to Karl Marx in advancing the economic interpretation of history. Yet most of his basic ideas, particularly nullification, were acquired from Madison. Remember, Madison in the Virginia and Kentucky Resolves, which were written by Madison and by Jefferson, talk about nullification. And that's when nullification first comes up, that's what Calhoun points to as the source. So he is remembered as a defender of minorities. However, he had no use for any minority. Think about it. When he is reaching the pinnacle of his political power, it's when voting has been expanded to more common males, white males in America, laborers, mechanics, abolitionists, things like that. It's not just people with money and land, right? And that's how Jackson gets voted into office. Well, Calhoun could care less about that group of people, not understanding, but that they were the ones who brought Jackson to the presidency. His solution to the problem of the preservation of the Union was basically to give the South everything it wanted. Again, not a compromiser. He's not the great compromiser, right? It's Clay. He was devoted to the Union, but in his idea of what the Union was. His death took him. So imagine if he lives another 10 years to see the Civil War come, he's probably one of the loudest voices to say, hey, you know what? We've tried everything we can. In that speech that I sent to you, he says that basically. He says, hey, if this is what it comes to, we've tried everything we can to make it not come to this. Of course, others would argue, well, maybe not everything, but that was his belief system. In 1850, shortly before his death, he tells a friend that the Union was bound to dissolve. Quote, I fix its probable occurrence within 12 years or 3 presidential terms. He nailed it on the head. In his thinking, he thinks, he's working backwards. It's really, with him, it's with the goal in mind. He works, you know how they say the ends justify the means? Well, it's almost the way he was thinking. He started with the end and said, how can I get there? This is how I'll get there. Historian, there's a historian by the name of William Trent from the late 19th century. In 1890, he said, quote, Calhoun started with the conclusion he wanted and reasoned back to the premises. Calhoun led thought rather than men, and lacking imagination, he led thought badly, unquote. Now, if John Calhoun was alive when that was stated, I foresee a duel at some point. But that historian is taking a shot at Calhoun. And it goes to the point again that Calhoun didn't build alliances. He said, hey, here is my thought. How am I going to get there? Here's my goal. How am I going to get there? And I don't care if Art's with me and Bert's with me and Fran is with me. If you're not, then you guys just don't understand. You're not smart enough to get it. So Calhoun's life was tragic. In that he really is seen as one of the big reasons that the South buys into or fights so hard to to maintain slavery. After the war, Walt Whitman in an interview said that he had heard a Union soldier say that the true monuments to Calhoun were the wasted farms and gaunt chimneys, unquote, that were scattered all over the South. And think about it, especially after Sherman's march to the sea, right? So Calhoun, a giant in American politics, just didn't quite have the right idea, if you will. All right, next up, we've got, pardon me as I get my notes together here, Henry Clay. So Clay, as we said, was known as the Great Compromiser. And the term I can't say correctly, pacificator, although I think I just said it right. It only took me 5 weeks. Clay was able to bring people. So unlike Calhoun, Clay could build alliances because he would be able to, in his mind, resolve people at opposite ends of the spectrum on their beliefs. Like, hey, slavery should expand. No, it shouldn't. Yes, it should. No, it shouldn't. He used persuasion, and also something that is in short supply in Washington and has been, common sense. He's saying, hey, wait a second. You're not going to get 100%. If I get 50 and you get 50, okay. So that sort of thing. His work at the start of 1850 really seals his reputation as a pacificator for whom a brokered political ideal or brokered political deal, pardon me, was desirable above all other considerations. Think of contemporarily the famous story of, you have Tip O'Neill, Speaker of the House, Ronald Reagan, President. Opposite parties, right? What would they do? Tip O'Neill said at the end of the day, what we would do is we would get together, have a glass of scotch, and figure out where we agreed, and that's how we would move forward. Of course, now it's, hey, Jim's idea stinks. Well, what's your idea? I don't know, but Jim stinks. So unfortunately, that's where we are. Clay, although he's the great compromiser, he rarely compromised on anything that would affect the health of the Union. He also, what was his other big idea? The American system. That was his baby. So he rarely compromised on that as well. He is portrayed as willing to bend his principles, not the first politician, to achieve the best political deal on one hand, while on the other hand, clinging, almost stubbornly to those principles out of nothing more than vanity because it's my idea, which sounds very much like Calhoun, right? The presidency, he runs 3 times, but doesn't make it. he famously said, and if only others would have said this, quote, "I would rather be right than be the president," unquote. He was an inspiration, not only to Lincoln in this book that I'm reading, but others of Lincoln's contemporaries, contemporaries of the day. Many of Clay's contemporaries conceded that he had been right more often than not. And unfortunately, that he had never become president, because the thought was he would have been, with his compromising background, maybe something could have happened to avert the Civil War. Now, again, the Compromise of 1850 only pushed it 10 years, but he's simply the Speaker of the House, right? At that point, he's not the president of the U.S. So, the legacy of Webster. And with each of these guys, it's really what happens over time. Think of Hamilton. It takes a full century after Hamilton's death for people to appreciate him. There are very few people, Lincoln, Washington, others that I'm sure come to mind, where upon their death, people say, "Oh my gosh, what an incredible person." For most, or for many, especially in politics, absence makes the heart grow fonder, right? So it's after a period of years or decades where their reputation grows and the appreciation for them. So during the first generation after his death, after Webster's death, abolitionists, and those who followed them remembered Webster's support of the Compromise of 1850, which he talks about in the March 7th speech. They said, he's really the guy that pulled it over the line. And of course, Clay's people say it's him. Stephen Douglas's people say it's him. The memoirs of John Quincy Adams, published in the 1870s. So Quincy Adams dies before the Civil War, but his memoirs are published in the 1870s, contained a reference to, quote, "the gigantic intellect, the envious temper, the ravenous ambition, and the rotten heart of Daniel Webster," unquote. I'm not a smart man. That does not sound like a compliment. Again, if they're both alive, draw your pistols. So, former friends called him godlike. Who wouldn't have a reputation being called that, right? He was a great statesman, a great orator, really one of probably the best of his day, better than Clay, better than Calhoun, who were, near the top of the food chain. Some of the patriotic phrases that he had used in response to Calhoun for the Compromise of 1850. Remember, Calhoun gives his talk, or has his speech read, on March 4th, 1850. Webster responds on the 7th. And Webster says, "Liberty, liberty, foe," in the vernacular of the day. That response was memorized by school children. I'm trying to think of today. I don't know if the Pledge of Allegiance would be comparable, but a lot of what Webster said was taught in schools and memorized by school kids. Maybe the Gettysburg Address, actually, is probably a better comparison. Although the Gettysburg Address, of course, much more weighty than a lot of what Daniel Webster had done. By the second half of the 20th century, Webster had kind of fallen away from history. He wasn't as well known. And quite honestly, now I know that we're all, and I say this lovingly, geeks, and we really enjoy this stuff. I don't know if you enjoy my teaching it, but at least the subject matter is pretty interesting. most people don't know about Henry Clay or John Calhoun or Daniel Webster, right? And it takes, the book that art is reading, Heirs to the Founder, or things like that to dig in deeper. And it's just a fascinating point in our nation's history. But a lot of people don't know about Webster, and really he starts falling away in the second half of the 20th century. He is seen as, now as he has kind of gained more recognition, yes, he's a great orator, but a lot of folks look at him as almost one of the first true Republicans, pardon me, and that he was a spokesman for business, right? The Republican Party is many times seen as the party of business and whatnot, and how business could promote the general welfare by helping everyone, right? Rather than just, what did Reagan say? Government isn't the answer to the problem, government is the problem. I agree with him in many instances, but there are also other instances where government absolutely can be the answer to the problem. Webster is seen as a guy who kind of falls in with Reagan and says, hey, wait, there's only so much the government can do. If we want to succeed, we have to expand, almost taking a page out of Hamilton too. We have to expand business opportunities, economic opportunities, those sorts of things, rather than just giving a handout to people and saying, oh, here's your, here's what the stimulus check or this or that. Don't get me wrong, great to get a stimulus check, but someone is going to have to pay the bill. So that's where we end with the legacy. We've got about 5 minutes left. I have a couple of things. Let me look real quickly on Lincoln, and then we'll actually end probably close to on time here. Bear with me 1 second. I want to see something really good to end on here. And what we can do is we'll end with the Emancipation Proclamation. So, and I know if you've taken my courses, you've probably heard this ad nauseum, but to me, it's a fascinating thing. So the Emancipation Proclamation truly is nothing more than an executive order, right? Nothing is approved by Congress. It's just Lincoln saying, hey, on January 1st, 1863, here's what's going to happen. So go back to July of 62. In a cabinet meeting, Lincoln says, I am going to issue an Emancipation Proclamation in my capacity as Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces in time of war. It would free all the slaves in areas still in rebellion. Moving forward after this, the war then moves from a war for union. It includes a war to end slavery. And a big reason for that, who is the South praying comes in on their side from Europe? England and France. Cotton, right? All those sorts of things. And Lincoln is saying, if we make this a war for slavery, there is no way on God's green earth that Great Britain and France are going to say, hey, yeah, we recognize the South now, and they're allowed to have slaves. So it really is an incredible political move. Lincoln, of course, is waiting for Union victory. 1862 is not the rosiest time for the Union Army. Seward, at this meeting in July, says to Lincoln, if you issue this in the current situation, it's going to be the last shriek of a dying republic. We have no firm leg to stand on here. So it's after Antietam where Lincoln says, I'm going forward to this. It, up until that time, is the most revolutionary measure ever to come from a president. In his message to Congress in December of 1862, after Democrats had increased their strength in the congressional election, Lincoln links emancipation to saving the Union. Quote, in giving freedom to the slave, we assure freedom to the free, honorable alike in what we give and what we preserve. We shall nobly save or meanly lose the last best hope on earth. And I think that's a good note to end on. So any questions, any comments?
Hey, Jim, on the emancipation, didn't he issue that like in September saying effective January 1st?
Right, it was after Antietam. So Antietam is mid-September, like September 16th, 17th. So it's afterwards where he says, hey, I got to strike while the iron is hot. And that's when he says, this becomes effective July or January 1st. Yes.
Didn't it, I believe I read somewhere that didn't the Lincoln's people meet with the South to try to basically say, if you give it up and give up the expansion areas, you can keep your slaves where you are if we stop the war now. I've just read that somewhere. I'm not sure of it, but
there was a Hampton Roads Peace Conference as the South is starting to take it on the chin, but it's not until a little bit later in the war.
okay.
And at that point, so if they have it at this point, or the South is going to say, we ain't getting rid of slavery. You've had a bad year. You've had Chancellorsville. You've had Fredericksburg. You've had, all these bad one after another battles. So we're not going to give this up. And actually Chancellorsville is in 1863. Sorry, getting my battles mixed up. But what happens here is that the South, Lincoln waits until they're in such a supreme and their strength grows. Of course, it's July 1863 with Vicksburg and Gettysburg that really is the death blow, although it still takes almost 2 years to end the war. But after the South has been hit hard, they come to Lincoln and say, hey, you know what? You wanted to talk about peace? And Lincoln says, basically, he takes a page from Grant, unconditional surrender. And what that includes, slavery is dead. It's gone. So, of course, the Confederates say, well, go jump in a lake. We're not going to sign up for that. You're going to have to beat us. And that's ultimately what happens. But yeah, there were overtures beforehand. And actually before, Lincoln says it is in his inaugural, I'm not going to interfere with slavery. If you stay in the Union, I will not interfere with it where it exists. And the South says, absolutely not. We're gonna go to war here. Anything else, folks?
Nope, that's it.
Okay, cool. Thank you so much for signing up for
That
this
was
again.
great, Jim. Thanks.
Really good,
Thank
Jim.
you. I know it's not it's so much better live and in person, and I'm hoping we will get there in a couple of weeks, but
Mhm.
hopefully in the fall
We are.
we will
Yes.
be there. Yes.
Yes.
So I appreciate your loyalty and your strong what's the word I want? Ability to put up with this. So
Yeah.
but enjoy the spring weather. If I don't see you on one of the upcoming talks, hopefully I will see you for our next class at the Grange. If you do take that, my one recommendation, bring a comfortable, whether it's a lawn chair or something, because all they have are picnic tables, and I'll also bring some in case folks don't bring it. But my thought is sitting at a picnic table without a back for an hour and a half or two listening to me is not going to be the most comfortable thing in the world. So if you have one, if you have a
Jim.
comfy chair you can bring it.
Okay.
Great.
Okay.
Thanks a lot,
Thank
Jim.
you.
All right. Take good care. See you
Okay.
soon.
See you
Thanks.
soon. Be safe.
You as well.